Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about part two on sort of the board oversight process. And part two is going to talk about public response to political issues. In part one, we talked about social, and I certainly invite you to see that. In part two, it's the all sensitive political issues. And joining me again for part two is Paul Washington, who's the executive director of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Center with the Conference Board. Welcome back, Paul.
Thanks very much, TK.
You did a separate executive summary white paper on the political issue topic titled Under a Microscope, a New Era of Scrutiny for Corporate Political Activity. And I want to invite everybody again to go to diligentinsights.com. We have a link to that executive summary white paper, and it's a worthy read for everybody on this sensitive topic. So much like in the social, Paul, we're going to sort of dig down a little bit. And my first question is very similar. What is the criteria that boards and management should be using to determine if the corporation should take a sort of a political position with these issues that come up and then actually make a public response?
Yeah, and thanks for that question. And just let me start off by saying there is clearly overlap between corporate activity on social issues and on political issues, but there are some important distinctions. First, I think social issues are a subset of the topics that you will address when it comes to corporate political activity. A lot of your corporate political activity deals with economic, regulatory matters that are not necessarily social ones. The second distinction is that speaking out or taking action on political issues is often a lot more fraught with regulatory and legal risk than doing things in the social sphere. It's much more highly regulated when it comes to political contributions and so forth. The third thing is that you can get in a lot more trouble by third parties when you're taking a stance on a political issue, because you'll be working through third-party lobbyists, third-party trade associations, you'll be giving money to politicians, and they're not always going to agree with your company values or employee values. So political issues, if anything, just want to start with this, it's more risky than social issues in some ways. But what you need to do is you do need to have clear criteria for when you will take a stance on a political issue. I think like social issues, you've got to make sure it's connected to your company values, but even more so, it's got to be aligned with your company's business interests. You've got to make sure that you in fact have proper controls in place to be taking a stand on this issue, that you're abiding by the laws and the regulations in this area. And even more than in the social issue sphere, you've got to vet the people you're giving money to, the organizations you're working with, making sure that you're not going to have guilt by association. So I think the emphasis on the legal regulatory side, the emphasis on business, and the emphasis on vetting the people you're giving money to or working with are really important criteria for companies to consider, along with, hey, if we take a stance, are we going to make a difference here, or are we just adding one more voice that's not going to change things?
When you bring in politics, you know that your employee staff is going to be split, okay? I have yet to find an organization where everybody would be supporting the same party. So that right there puts an issue on the table that you have to deal with. The other one that I would say, Paul, that might have some sensitivity to be aware of is the CEO's personal opinion, okay? Sometimes that ends up coming out in some kind of statement, and I think that's where the CEO needs to make sure that they keeps that sort of to himself, and it doesn't look like that's a corporate response.
Those are great points. And if you don't handle that appropriately, you're going to turn your corporation into yet another polarized and partisan entity. So it's really important not to conflate the CEO's personal views with those of the company. And that has a lot to do with how you phrase the company's response. Your CEO may be the best spokesperson on political issues because they can speak authoritatively to the government and to other stakeholders. But it should be quite clear that you've got a process in place and criteria in place to make sure that what you're doing when you're speaking is you're speaking on behalf of the company, and that you're doing so in a way that's reflective of the company's position, not the CEO's position. The other thing that goes along with this is to be clear when it's the company speaking or when it's your corporate political activity committee speaking, your PAC speaking, because PACs, as you know, they're funded by employees. They're ultimately governed by the company, but it's employee-controlled funds. And companies don't do, I think, a good enough job distinguishing with these are the contributions made by our employee-funded PAC. So I think there's also an opportunity here to make that clearer and educate your employees and others about what a PAC is, why it exists, and whom they give money to, which is actually somewhat separate from the corporation.
I know a lot of companies, and again, there's a blurred line here because sometimes the social issues have a political sensitivity to it, but I know companies that would take a position on a social issue that would never think of taking an issue on a political stuff, just because they feel that the ice is too thin on that and the risk too high for what happens. But
you're right. And in fact, even on issues like we've got a report that's going to come out on corporate investments in racial equality a year after the death of George Floyd. One thing that's interesting is that only 4% of the companies we surveyed had coupled their corporate philanthropic response to racism with a public policy response to racism. Now, there are many companies who are working with their local law enforcement on criminal justice reform and so forth, but it's interesting, exactly what you're saying. There's a big drop-off. It's often easier to sort of take the stance, with your employees and with your philanthropy and so forth. It's often tougher to do so in the public policy arena because you've got other irons in the fire.
So let's make the assumption, like we did in the social issues, that the company has come to the conclusion that all the stars have aligned and this is something that we're comfortable in taking a position on and then communicating that position. And I suspect that the process is somewhat the same, but let's review that. And if there's anything else that's a nuance to the political, Paul, versus the social, could you sort of highlight that?
Sure, happy to. So again, let's start with the board's role on corporate political activity. Boards have really stepped up and taken a stronger oversight role with respect to corporate and PAC political contributions, but they haven't necessarily done so in the area of lobbying. So I think it's really helpful for companies to make sure that their boards, again, under the heading of no surprises is a good rule with your board. Make sure your board is aware of your processes and your internal controls governing both political contributions and your lobbying activity so that they're aware of the scope of what you're doing. Also, talk to your board about simplifying your efforts because, frankly, the more complex your political activity is, the greater risks you're running. So that's when it comes to the board side. Again, so no surprises. When it comes to rolling out your stance on a political issue, I really think it helps for companies to lay the groundwork on educating, especially their employees, but also their customers and others on what their approach is to corporate political activity. Do they make contributions? What are the rules on lobbying? Set expectations that, in fact, we're going to make sure our actions as a company are consistent with our values. But, sometimes the people we give money to won't act in a way that we believe, and we have to do a balancing there. So I think educating people and setting expectations is really important. The final thing is consider involving your employees in your political activity. In fact, visiting folks on Capitol Hill, going to state legislatures. I mean, employees can add a lot of value because they can add authenticity. It's not just your lobbyist going in to talk to the policymakers, but also it helps educate your employees about the political process. And they go back and talk to their colleagues about what it was like. So I think looking at employees as a resource to basically to educate and actually engage is something companies can consider doing in this arena.
So this sort of harkens me back to what the foundation of this show is in board effectiveness and board leadership. Here's a perfect example where if this particular topic or the socials has not been on the board agenda, or people are not prepared for this, where sometimes no statement does make a statement. Here's the time that board leadership should make sure that the CEO and the board sits down and make sure that everybody's on the same page with how they're going to handle these situations. And again, as you said, have a process that they're going to go through, because if not, it's going to be very evident, like you said, when the opportunity comes up and all of a sudden everybody's scrambling.
Yeah, or pointing fingers, right? And look, companies are asked to play a broader role in society than ever before, but they don't necessarily have the capabilities and sort of the muscle memory to do it. So boards should make sure that management is building those internal capabilities and has thought this thing through. You don't want to have the board micromanage, though, right? You don't want them making every decision about every political contribution or every social issue, because you will distract and factionalize your board. But they've got to feel comfortable that management knows what it's doing in this area.
Paul, 5 years ago, very few companies even had this on their distant agendas for this. But in the last 2 years, social issues, pandemics, acts of violence across the country, all kinds of issues have put the board right into the limelight. So I want to thank you. Both these topics, the political and the social, are very, very pertinent right now. Again, a lot of times it's areas that boards have not had a lot of experience with. So I want to thank you for taking the time and covering both of these in the last two shows.
Thank you very much. And thanks for highlighting them for all the directors out there. I think you're providing a great service to corporate America on this.
Again, just a reminder, everybody, this white paper on both the social and the political is available in the show summaries on diligentinsights.com. I highly recommend it. So go in there, click on the link. It's short, sweet, but really highlights some of the points that all the boards and management should be thinking about when they have to deal with this issue. So thanks again, Paul.
Thank you.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.